Shatter 163. The child who lived in the dome by the river was trying to decide what kind of beautiful the day was. He squatted a couple of steps from the white silver band of the water, dark sand squishing between his toes. Beautiful. More beautiful. Or most beautiful. He splayed his small fingers, patting the stone he had just warmed with magic before flopping over in the soft sand to lay his cheek against it. That way he could feel the heat with his face, too. He had learned the spell only a few days ago. His mother would come soon, and he would show her that he had done it all by himself. And she would be proud of him. That will make it one of the more beautiful days, he thought. He decided to think about his new spell with one half of his attention and listen for the familiar sound of her approaching footsteps with the other. They were never apart for long. As soon as being alone became less interesting and happy than being together would be, she appeared. That was how the world worked. The warm stone felt good, and the cool sand felt good, and the wind tickled his legs and arms where they stuck out of his long shirt. If he fell asleep for long, he would wake in bed. His mother's arms would be wrapped around him, or her voice would be, as she sang him the names of things sung. If he got up and ran as fast as he could on his short legs, the air would fill his chest, and he would see parts of the river he'd never seen before. And as soon as he went far enough to wonder if going too far might be a possibility, as soon as he tried to figure out what one should feel if they went too far from home, he would see that he hadn't really gone far at all. The way back to the dome was always clear and easy to walk when he wanted it. This was what life was. He heard footsteps. They sound different than I expected, he thought, delight tingling through him. I'm getting a surprise. Different almost always meant a surprise. Surprises almost always made the day most beautiful. He sat up and looked around. His mother was there, standing side by side with the most amazing surprise of the child's whole life. Stu, she said, this man is Jenithart !H. He is your father. Stu stared at the new adult, him, the man, Jenithart !H, father. The ideas blossomed inside him, and he realized he had always wanted this even though he'd never once felt the lack of it. He gasped and ran forward, arms outstretched. Father. There you are, and here I am. I love you so much. He grabbed the man around the legs, blinking up to meet pink eyes. Hair that was almost white spilled down father's shoulders. He smelled different than mother. His skin was paler than hers, his nose a little larger, and the expression on his face was one Stu didn't know, though he was sure it must be a good one. This is the most beautiful day there has ever been, Stu said, still clinging to him. Do you think so too, father? Line of asterisks. Line of asterisks. It's been a long while since someone chose Maker of Narrow Ways, Stuart was saying. I've spent almost as much time talking to the contract about the possibilities and having calls with designers greater than and theorists greater than as I have in class. But about a month ago I finally got every involved person to agree that my desired personalizations greater than and self-concept greater than would be excellent in their own ways greater than instead of in conflict greater than with a skills core greater than. He paused for his first breath in ages. Jenithart !H had left to go change her clothes after a short bickering session with her cousin, so it was just the two of them again. Alden was sitting on the ground, leaning against the tree that had been his backrest for most of the morning and eating his lunch out of the to-go tiffin he'd packed earlier. Stuart had sat down to eat with him only to bounce right back up to grab the first wood block his spell effect had struck, which was the least damaged of them all. He'd held the broken pieces together to show Alden the approximate shape of the hole that had been formed in it. It was an oversized bean if you used your imagination. Now, Stuart was standing beside his magical handiwork. He kept looking from his bean bullet, still in its landing spot beside its partner, to Alden like he couldn't decide which one was more worthy of his attention. Alden opened his mouth to ask a question, and Stuart hastily said, I know. Naturally, you're worried about whether I'll be able to use the skill the way I want to and hoping I won't be disheartened with my choice during the early years of my knighthood. Maybe you're thinking that it's ill-chosen greater than and I should instead consider a more certain course for I'm not thinking any of those things. Alden cut in, setting aside the ceramic jar of greasy, tasteless pudding he'd just eaten a bite of. It was by far the worst of all the random snacks he had added to his lunch, but since he'd taken it he felt obligated to finish it. "You're not?" He looked so thrilled to hear it that Alden hated to point out the very obvious thing that he seemed to have forgotten. Stuart was high on the aftermath of his casting success and Alden's own enthusiasm for what he'd done. As soon as I said the spell was awesome he launched into this mode, and he hasn't slowed down since. "I do think you might have temporarily forgotten that I'm not Artoman," Alden said. Stuart blinked at him. "So I can't really judge your choice. I have almost no knowledge. To me, what you did is incredible, and I think a skill that both transports things and destroys obstacles in its path is going to be so impressive when you grow it. But I probably understand about 1% of what you really did, and when it comes to the pressures you're under to pick the right thing. I don't even know how many skills you have to choose from." "Of course." Stuart's neck purpled. I got too excited. "No. I don't think it's possible to be too excited about your skill choice. It will always be part of who you are in the future, so screw you, overly certain 15-year-old idiot Alden. Why didn't you take at least a few weeks to think like this back in February? So you need to really think about what you're doing with it and find something that makes you that excited." Stuart smiled, picked up his beans, and came over to take a seat facing him. "I should let you ask questions," he said. "Since I'm not sure what you understand." "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Alden said. "But that might take years. How about we start with what just happened? You made a tunnel. Will your skill always work like that?" "It always will when I'm doing this kind of thing with it." "Yes, the spell I cast created a tunnel, a way for the bean to reach its destination. The construct greater than formed quickly, moving from one being to the other and denying everything else the right to occupy that space as it came into existence. Then the bean traveled through to its destination unimpeded greater than. The tunnel isn't all created in an instant," Alden said, just to be sure he understood. "It begins forming at bean 1, then continues forming toward bean 2. In a straight line?" Stuart nodded. "And everything in between gets." Alden almost said punched through, but then he reconsidered. "Is the tunnel at its full width from the start and moving forward like a finger poking holes in sheets of paper? Or is it expanding into existence as it goes?" "It expands," Stuart said. "When you do it with your skill, will it work the same way? Or will the whole tunnel form at once? Eventually, I should have significant control over the process. But motion towards something is part of the skill concept. A way is meant to be traveled, so having it appear fully made between 2 points instead of having it progress from one to the other." He craned his neck back and stared thoughtfully up at the forest canopy. "I'm sure I could do it with practice. One day. But I can't think of many reasons to do it when forming ways nearly instantaneously would be good enough and produce stronger results. This is pretty fascinating." And it was more confirmation that Alden's own ideas about how bearer worked were on the right track. "Your skill is weaker when it's being used for things that are less itself," he said. Stuart stopped gazing up at the branches and met his eyes again. His brows were slightly elevated. "The skill isn't weaker. The effects of it are. It's an important distinction greater than. You can bring the same amount of authority to bear, but skills become more undeniable greater than when what you want to do with them reflects their natures." "All skills?" "Of course." But then he added, "I don't know as much about avowed skills. Some skills are more rigid than others, and that would mean there was less variation and possibility in their function. A skill can be limited in all kinds of ways, until it crosses the threshold toward being defined as a spell impression. A skill called Maker of Narrow Ways for Kata beans could be created, and then the person who bound themselves to it probably wouldn't be able to do anything but move Kata beans through bean-sized ways. I'm glad you didn't pick that one. The other newlings greater than would probably hesitate to be in squads greater than with someone who picked a skill that peculiar," Stuart replied. "I did have trouble choosing. Weighing what skills could contribute to our purpose with how they suited me personally was difficult. Finding one that could be meaningful to me in the right ways was a lengthy search. Alden had promised himself, while he watched Stuart set up the spell, that he wouldn't have selfish dickhead thoughts about how different their skill selection experiences were. And so far it was mostly working. Given Stuart's single quotations general intensity level, Alden had been afraid that he might have chosen something insane for himself. Like a skill called I cut off my own fingers in exchange for making mountains explode. Or something equally difficult to live with. So he was still feeling relieved that instead he'd seen a cool magical effect that would surely have multiple powerful and practical uses for a future night, without any loss of blood or added anguish on the caster's part. And the Artonan boy's enthusiasm for showing the spell off and talking about it was infectious. What made Narrow Ways the perfect one? Alden asked. Stuart's answer was a little slow in coming. He picked up a fallen leaf and wove it through his fingers. I wanted to be able to cut through things, he said after a moment. But I didn't want the skill to be built on a foundation of separation. Maker of Narrow Ways can be used for severing, greater than, but it's not for severing. The cutting is something that forms a connection, instead of something that breaks one. It's a skill that can reflect what has shaped my past and what I hope for in my future. He dropped the leaf. I'm sure when it's all done and my peers have a chance to look away from their own choices and consider mine, many of them will think I've gone too far in pursuit of personal meaning at the expense of efficiency. But at least my family supports this part of my decision. Vuel said it was a go as odd as I was, but she meant it in a complimentary way. It's not efficient? No. I want to use Maker of Narrow Ways on the battlefield, but it wasn't designed for that. There are easier methods for destroying things or sending them across short distances. I'm sure I'll find many opportunities to take full advantage of it. But often, to get the effect I want, I'll be straining my authority more than I would with other skills. Oh yeah. That makes perfect sense now that he says it. Constructing a rapid transport tunnel through space was extremely fancy, but it was a convoluted way of dealing damage. It's like me using my skill to behead someone in gym, said Alden. Just because I can do it doesn't mean I'm a natural beheader. That word for removing someone's head is only for formal executions. You want to use the other one, unless you are deliberately implying that Avowed Winston is a terrible criminal. Alden thought for a second. Would it come across as funny mean or serious if I used the original word? It would be funny mean if an Artonan said it. If you do, people are just going to think you accidentally used the wrong word. Maybe it would work if you laughed after saying it? And yes, you understand what I mean about efficiency. If a skill called the Slicer of Necks exists, we can assume it's better at doing that chore with a smaller authority commitment than your preservation skill is. Although circumstances affect everything. What's Maker of Narrow Ways supposed to do? Alden asked. What was it designed for? Stuart opened his mouth then shut it. He thought for a few seconds before saying, its intended use is cross-dimensional exploration. Why the pause there? Alden wondered. It will be very efficient for that particular thing. And it's what the few previous users selected it for. The fact that it's not immediately capable of doing that was a source of misery greater than for them even though they knew to expect it. To bind yourself and spend your early years of service unable to use your skill in the way you want. For me, it will be better. There will be problems but not unassailable greater than ones, I'm sure. Alden looked past him to the line of destroyed blocks and burst fruit. I still think it's amazing. Yes. Stuart said, eagerness returning. Its roots drink from concepts like connection, motion toward goals, precision greater than, and creation. Build on creation. Not destruction. Even though it's capable of destroying. That's what you wanted. Stuart watched him take another bite of the tasteless pudding. Alden was still trying to produce enough saliva to get the remnants of it out of his mouth and down his throat, when Stuart said, My father's first skill is called Cleaver of Strength. Did you already know that? Alden shook his head. It's a skill very different from mine really. Associated with concepts like severing, ambition, Fair play greater than. Fair play? Father always mentions that one. I doubt the people who designed the skill would have listed it as a core part, but the way we see our skill and the choices we make in the development of it matter. Attacking at the point of greatest strength with your own greatest strength is a sort of fairness. And that's what Father's skill is best at. You do usually think of attacking a problem at its weak point, not its strong one, Alden said. The skill is very complementary with Escherty's power. That's one of the reasons he and Linda spend time here. Escherty has progressed quickly over the past years, and he and Father wanted to see how well they might work together. The three of them could be a powerful team. Alden didn't doubt it. Linda slowed the enemy. Genethart cleaved it, turning its greatest strength into a weakness, a crack. And Escherty cleaned up. Father used that skill to kill Mother and separate her from my mind, Stuart said. As well as he could. Alden slowly set aside the food. What did he just say? What the hell? He watched Stuart's face for some clue as to how he should respond. But before he could come up with anything that felt like an appropriate reaction, the primary son went on. Father and a few others once traveled to a world that had suffered a sudden and very severe chaos breakthrough. It was clear to everyone that there was an intelligence of some sort responsible. Those are often the most dangerous situations. Someone had to respond swiftly, and so there was little opportunity for Father and his companions to study the nature of the enemy before beginning their assault on it. It was an unexpectedly difficult place. Father says they struggled to know what direction they traveled in, and though they sensed the demon and understood how it affected them, they couldn't find it. As the corruption increased, two of the three he traveled with became too weak to continue. They attempted a teleportation ritual, to send those two back home. It's not easy to do from a place like that, and though the contract here on Ortona I did register a possible teleportation attempt and try to stabilize it. It failed. When the failure was reported, and no further attempts came, most people suspected that the whole group had died. Stuart let his hands fall to the ground beside him, fingers digging into the leaf mulch. A woman called Ella Enwer, who was ranked 68th, had become a dear friend of my father's over the course of their meetings. They had sworn no promises to each other, but I've been told that most people hoped they would. Someday soon. When he went to that place, she was actually here at the house, mentoring greater than Rule. She joined the first group that was sent to help with the problem. They teleported to the nearest stable planet and took a fortified ship greater than the rest of the way. Almost a whole day before they arrived, they say she felt something about the chaos spreading from that place. She looked at the others and said, "How fortunate. This is the kind of enemy I have forged myself to face." Line of asterisks. Line of asterisks. On the most beautiful day there had ever been, Stu's family sat by the river together for a long time. His mother held him in her lap, combing his hair with her fingers. His father sat across from them, holding the rock Stu had given him as a present, even though the spell had worn off and it wasn't warm anymore. "Ella," his voice said. And again. "Ella, please." Many of the things Father said had a way of falling away from Stu's memory, until only the cadence and the fact of his voice speaking were left. But it was all right. Maybe the words were drifting downstream. Wasn't that a lovely idea? "Would you like to see one of the patient creatures in the water?" Stu asked suddenly. "Father, have you seen them?" The pink eyes fell on him. "Have you only taught him the Richian vocabulary? Not the whole unified tongue?" "Because then we'll know," Stu's mother said, her fingers still combing. "If he ever says a word that isn't Richian, we'll know it slipped through and affected him." "Oh, Ella. What slipped through?" Stu asked curiously. A picture came to him, one of the clear and true ones, of the little blue wigglers he liked to watch, slipping in and out of holes they'd made in thick patches of sponga plant. And he knew that was what they were talking about. "So I might see one of those today, too." "That would be perfect." Line of asterisks. Line of asterisks. "The behavior of demons is a never-ending subject of research," Stuart said to Alden. but the ones that are prone to remaining greater than often have stubborn drives greater than and urges that might be called goals. The one responsible for that breakthrough was probably a wizard who, before his fall, was obsessed with the field of mind manipulation. We're almost sure that we know his name, but the being was so unrecognizable when Father finally located the last remnants and destroyed them, that confirming its original identity wasn't possible. Oh, okay then, Alden thought, feeling his own eyebrows trying to escape off his face into the sky. We're just going to straight up tell me that a single wizard can turn into a super demon and cause an apocalypse-level chaos event. He'd sort of suspected that already. Kibby had said she had to be tested more often than the other people at the lab to make sure it was safe for her to live there without becoming the strong authority version of the chaos-spreading grasshoppers. So the wizard-to-demon type of demon had been a possibility in Alden's mind. He just hadn't expected Stuart to casually confirm it was true and add in the fact that it could be really, really bad when that happened. Stuart did you miss the class on proper discretion that the rest of your species gets, buddy? This is like Kibby all over again, only you have way more adult intel. My mother's skill was the Ensner greater than of minds, and in some ways, the entire planet had become a chaotic mind snare under the influence of the origin demon greater than. She was the best choice to find Father and help him push back the many-sided dangers greater than until they could locate the perverse one and kill it. The others who'd come on the mission of rescue helped for a time, but eventually it was only the two of them left. Stuart caught Alden's gaze with his own. My parents fought side by side in that agony-scape greater than every day, cleansing it of corruption. Often, Father rested his mind and recovered in the shelter she made for him with her skill. And whenever they became worn by the struggle, they pleasured one another to remember the brightness of life. I was conceived greater than in that way. Alden narrowly stopped his mouth from making a comment about not needing to know that much. It would be rude, and besides, he didn't actually feel that way about it. He was only startled the conversation had gone there, not embarrassed or offended. Minimizing the serious moment with an offhand remark wasn't what he wanted. Some kind of social reflex, I guess. It was a garbage social reflex in this case. Artonans had different norms. And they were poetic, especially about significant things. Your parents making you was pretty significant. Back at Matadero, Portiloth was probably still muttering judgments about humanity because nobody had written down the exact spot where Alden's umbilical cord had been cut. My mother was the one who made a victory that didn't involve the total destruction of the world possible, Stuart said. But they were relying so heavily on her. And even though she was skilled, when a battle of minds wearies you, it can weaken you in ways that are difficult to detect. For some reason, she didn't tell Father she was pregnant with me. Probably to spare him from the likelihood of my loss. But as they were approaching the end of the long fight, she told him she couldn't go on. Escape vessels and backup greater than had been sent to a solidified greater than part of the planet by then. So it should have been all right. When Father finished his work and made it to the main ship, they told him she'd gone back to the mother planet. By teleportation ritual. She'd made them believe that. He was worried for her, and he'd been away from home for so much longer than planned, so he had them send him right back here to see her in person. And he realized something was very wrong. Stuart suddenly stopped talking. Alden picked up the pudding and took another bite so that it didn't feel quite so much like they were having an awkward silence. At some point before she left him, she had decided that their successes weren't real. All the progress she had made seemed like tricks the demon was playing on her, traps she was failing to detect. Stuart swallowed. When Father finally found us, she had gone to a safe planet to give birth to me, but she thought we hadn't really made it to safety. She thought her escape had failed, that it was all a mind trap, an elegant one, like she herself could create, not the sort of thing they'd actually encountered in that place. In her mind, the demon had become an impossible enemy who was always as strong, smart, and sophisticated greater than as she was herself. So she'd waited for help to come. She protected me with her authority and tried to make sure that no matter what happened I wouldn't experience suffering. She raised me in her own mind trap. Alden swallowed the greasy lump of pudding. She used her skill to remove everything that might be painful, frightening, or even slightly uncomfortable from my attention. It was the gift of the loving lie carried to its furthest extreme. When Father found us, I loved him at once. Of course. I had never felt unhappiness or known of a threat. I remember him trying to talk to me several times, to explain something, but most of those words are gone. She erased a lot of them because they might have confused me, and by then, she considered even that much to be a suffering I shouldn't experience. He tells me he was fighting to hide how upset he was. That he argued with her in my presence when he couldn't persuade her to leave with him or free me from the trap. But I don't remember it that way. It's all so soft and happy. It was even soft and happy at the very end. Line of asterisks. Line of asterisks. Another most beautiful day. Father and Mother had held him all morning. He liked that his life included 2 sets of slightly different arms. 2 smells. 2 great loves. More was better. Now, they had words to say to each other that Stu could not hear. They are talking about a surprise, he thought. The only unknown things were surprises. He looked down through the water at the patient creatures. They rested on the bottom, black and not quite round. Covered in sharp points. Stu didn't touch those. I want to touch them, though. Why is it I don't touch them? Had he shown them to Father already? He'd meant to, but he couldn't remember doing it. I don't think I have. That's exciting. I'll show him when he comes to the river again. And then, suddenly, there was a feeling that had never existed before. Like the world breaking. Something's not beautiful, thought Stuart single quote H. Something's the most not beautiful. And then he was lying on his back in the sand, and his mother was running her fingers through his hair. Mother. I love you. You're very happy today, Stu. I am, he agreed. He heard footsteps coming, and then his father was there, standing above him. And his mother was gone. So quick. Stu thought. So wonderful. She must have done it with a spell. His father's face was wearing one of those expressions Stu didn't know. May I sit beside you? You may hold me, said Stu. That would be the most good. A moment later, arms were around him. I'm glad you're all right. I have something to tell you, his father said after a while. It's a surprise. I knew there would be one. Stu said. What is it? The surprise is that you have older brothers and sisters. And I'm going to take you on a trip to see them. Stu blinked. He blinked many times. He was sure he'd never had to think so hard in his life. Brothers and sisters like some animals have? Yes. Do they look just like me? No. They look different. But all of you are most beautiful. Did you hear that, Mother? Stu called excitedly. We're going to see my brothers and sisters. The arms around him shook. When Stu called, his mother appeared. As she always had. This time it was very fast, and she was standing right in front of them. On top of the water. Another special spell, he thought. One day, she'll teach me that one, too. Line of asterisks. Line of asterisks. The more he tried to reason with her, the more suspicious she became that he wasn't himself, Stuart told Alden. Instead of persuading her that she was badly hurt, he was only making her think that he might be someone she had to protect me from, too. Pushing any more would make her fight him, and he was afraid that leaving would convince her she was right and make her panic. She was unwell enough and dangerous enough that if he had called for help from the Triplanets and explained the truth of the matter, the outcome would most likely have been similar or worse. So before she could hurt me or drag me completely beyond recovery, he struck her down with his skill. Oh my God, Stuart. It was a long time ago, said Stuart, reaching over to touch Alden's knee with a hand. Apparently, Alden looked like he needed comforting. And I was so young. The day of her death was much more awful for him than for me. I didn't even realize something bad had happened. Because. Stuart smiled. Father was much worse at cleaving than usual. What do you mean? Ella was so powerful. And I was so delicate. In some ways, her life had become her devotion to watching over me. If he'd struck at her point of greatest strength, he'd have been killing me, too. And he wouldn't do that. So he was more tentative, greater than. Maybe she realized it was coming, too, and did something deliberate, enacted greater than some final plan she had made. Because a very lifelike version of her was still with me after it was done. Anytime I looked for her, she was there watching over me as she always had been. The hallucinations you mentioned, Alden said. Stuart nodded. She even went on protecting me from life. For a time. What was left of the mind trap had holes in it, but they didn't show at first. I feel so sorry for Father. He thought I was doing well enough on our trip home. The Artonan boy laughed a little. Alden was shocked that Stuart could do that, but hearing the sound lent some of the horror he was feeling. I was extremely unusual. Of course. But I loved the spaceship. I was happy. And he thought my occasional conversations with my missing mother were understandable coping greater than and confusion greater than that the mind healers would be able to fix. He didn't realize I was still living in a world separate from everything else until we had been traveling a while. Stuart touched his own bottom lip. I was running down a corridor on the ship, and I fell. I bit my lip. For some reason that was the first time the illusion completely failed. Nothing so shocking had ever happened to me. I'm sure it didn't hurt much at all, but I had no way of understanding it and putting it into context greater than. I was terrified. Even the sound of myself crying scared me. It felt like my body was out of control because I'd never sobbed before. And when I looked around for my mother, for the first time in my life, she wasn't there. I know it's probably hard to imagine. He looked at Alden. But after that, I started having episodes greater than every now and then, when she would disappear and I'd suddenly realize that the bed sheets were too itchy or the food tasted different than I was expecting. Those things were just as dire greater than to me as actual injuries. I'd get confused and scared and start screaming. Father would do everything he could think of to figure out what was wrong and fix it. He didn't even try to explain that Mother was really gone and that when I saw her it wasn't her. Just the last gift she'd given me, the protection of the flawless world I'd always known. The breeze picked up, tossing the treetops. Alden watched a few of the fallen leaves skitter across the circular white stone Stuart had stood on to cast his spell. I understand why you picked your skill now, he said. You can cut with it, like your father. But you didn't want to focus on the separation. You wanted to focus on the fact that, he couldn't think of how to put it. The fact that the severing of something can be what connects you to a goal. Or a better place. Or people who love you in a better way, said Stuart single quote H. Alden took another bite of his pudding. He was almost through with the stuff. Finally. Stuart's brow furrowed. Do you enjoy eating it that way? It's not my favorite thing, Alden said politely, but my stomach is well filled. I see. Stuart looked amused. You're eating it just to have perfect manners. You can stop that. We aren't in the middle of one of the famines of old. I think the planets can afford for one person to throw part of his second meal away. I'm just trying to be a good guest for you. I don't want anyone to say you chose wrong after I left. What is this stuff? Alden looked down into the container. It looks like vanilla pudding, so I thought maybe it would be sweet. So much Artonan food is sweet. But this is not. Stuart was grinning broadly now. What? The Artonan boy started laughing, much harder than he had a moment ago. It's oil. It's for frying things in. Not for eating plain. Alden stared at him. You've been sitting here watching me eat a cup of pure fat. I thought maybe humans enjoyed that. You had so many bites. We don't enjoy that. Alden was aghast. I've almost finished the whole container. Stuart laughed so hard he looked like he was about to topple over. What is this going to do to my stomach? I don't know what it will do to you, said Stuart. If you were an Artonan. Ha! If you were an Artonan it would probably make you shitty. Stuart single quote H. Line of asterisks. I wanted to ask you, said Alden, as they collected the supplies and the broken blocks for their trip back to the house, if I can call you Stu. If it's not alright yet, you can say so. The Artonan gave him a baffled look. Obviously you can. I do like the special human name you've given me, though. Many people call me Stu. Nobody else calls me Stuart. Oh. I started doing that a couple of minutes after I met you. When I thought you were a total dumbass. You only purposefully mispronounce my name and give bees. It's so nice. I'll keep doing it then. Thank you. Stuart. Stuart nodded. I guess Whirly Roden asked you to mispronounce his, too. Joe. He's not Joe anymore, said Alden, dragging the remains of the Berserk fruit over to the casting stone. He's lost the honor of being called Joe. Do you know he's on Earth right now? I recommended he go there, said Stuart. He was the most powerful wizard I was sure I could talk into leaving right away. Alden stopped dragging. The sackfruit tentacle felt like a giant gummy bear in his hand. You sent him to help Anzidora? I respectfully suggested. Stuart, Roden's a jackass, but he's been a huge help. And you're cool as fuck. Do look up all of those English words by the way. I'll help you figure out the internet. I don't have trouble with the internet. I'll help you figure it out. I'm not struggling. Alden's stomach made a disgusting gurgling sound. Chapter 164. Well? Viul asked, stealing an ink brush from the tray in front of Mban. She twirled it once, then dragged the tip of it around one of her middle fingers. It left a slender spiral of red ink in its wake. You braved Stu's wrath to go have a look at the two of them. What did you learn? What do you think of human Alden? That was my next brush. Mban didn't look up from her work. They were the only ones in the formal dining room. Viul sprawled on top of the table in front of Mban's tray, which was full of brushes with colorful enameled handles. She was using them to ink an intricate pattern of lines onto a hexagonal white card. As for the human, I think. After a moment, Viul rolled over to face her, propping her chin on her hands. Think faster. It's hard to think of anything but the fact that you're lying on the dining table like a roast. Live long, my young cousin, and learn that everywhere can be your longer. What if the Avad walks through? Mban lowered her voice. How will he feel seeing a powerful Hentian rolling around and painting meaningless designs on herself? He may never sleep at ease again. Didn't he just watch you get covered in fruit juice? That wasn't my fault. And I'm sure he doesn't hold me to the same standard. Baby Stu's new friend seems very casual on our calls, said Viul. She waved the brush she'd taken under Mban's nose. Tell me about him. I barely spoke to him, Mban said. But he seemed. Viul sat up. Do you not like him? Is he bad for my brother? Should I bury him in a hole so deep that even Aunt Alice can't find him? She gasped. Does he not like Stu? Is he faking it? Mban set the brush she'd been using aside. Alden was inoffensive. He seemed very interested in Stu's spell, despite how long he must have been sitting there watching. I just expected him to be taller? Hairy? Special, said Mban. Or impressive. In some immediately apparent way. For Stu to become so attached and insistent about him. I know he spent too much time contemplating the human boy's death because your father scolded him about that ridiculous situation during his school entrance exams. Stu does like his contemplating. And I know that Alden must have depth of character, for him to have earned Grandaunt Alice's favor. She lowered her voice even further. But Stu's expectations for a lasting friendship don't make sense, do they? He's a rehab single quotee whose passion must be something like lab assistant work. Stu doesn't even like laboratory classes. They have absolutely nothing in common that I can think of. And their lives will be even less alike next year, 3 years from now, 30. Viul rolled over again and sat up, wearing a thoughtful look. That could be one of the things Stu likes about him. The fact that they've got nothing in common? The early years of your knighthood are the hardest, said Viul. There's nothing like the closeness you feel with your first few squads. You carry each other. But you lose people so unexpectedly. Mban looked away. Human Alden might not be able to walk with Stu, but he'll be a lot easier to keep safe. Do you think Stu thinks that way? Mban asked. Maybe not. Vuel said brightly. But I'm thinking that way now. We can summon Human Alden every day to keep Red Alden company, and that way nothing bad will ever happen to either of them. I suppose that's true. I don't know how Stu might feel about that. Don't worry about it. Go back to decorating your bonfire cards. Why are you decorating those? Mban swept her hand slowly over the tray. I've decided this is the perfect hobby. Over the next few weeks I will make hundreds of these. Vuel peered at her. That's your idea of the perfect thing to do to sort your thoughts after your second affixation? Yes. It's taken me a while to pick, but this will be ideal. You could go to all the best parties. I could introduce you to people. Why don't you try some pleasure travel? Ooh. Demand that an exquisite tongue of knowledge tutor you to sleep every night. Or if you want to make things, Kofa dug a cave into the side of a cliff one year. I'm going to make a card for every guest at my parents' summer sending feast. Someone is sure to say, the cards are almost too beautiful to burn this year. Mban's eyes lit and I'll say, I made them for you with my own hands. Every line has been touched with my thoughts on the importance of sacrifice. Think of me as you burn them. Mban picked up another brush. Eventually, Vuel said, so the thing that's going to keep you motivated over the coming days is adding a coat of misery to a summer sending ceremony? I'm only adding a coat of perspective. If misery is the result. Mban shrugged. As long as it makes you happy, I support it. I do retract my offer of taking you to parties with me, though. Line of asterisks. Line of asterisks. 2 learning cushions, both made by the craftswoman Enelturg, rested side by side in front of the cottage window. Alden and Stuart knelt facing each other. All right, said Stuart. Tell me everything you can about your skill. That way I can help you practice. And we might come up with ideas for defeating some of your classmates together. Alden wanted to tell him then. Stuart had just shared his own skill. It was important and personal and I can't fully reciprocate. He didn't know if he would have. Probably not, right? If I'm not lying to myself. It's just too soon. And too dangerous. Most of the control Alden had over his own future relied on him not showing anyone else what he was until he was ready. He was way too aware of that. But of his 2 enormous secrets, the skill would have been the one he was a little less afraid of sharing. Especially if he didn't mention the authority sense along with it. And at this particular moment, knowing that he wouldn't be able to do that without permission from Joe, rankled. Why does Whirly fucking Roden get to control how I talk about myself? Why should he? Alden only knew the truth about his own skill because of the wizard. Most likely, he would have spent years not knowing without Joe's intervention. It wouldn't have been forever, though, would it? Having an authority sense, leveling at this rate, I would have figured out something was up with my skill on my own a lot faster than Joe expected. Because it was a useful talent, because Gorgon had recommended it, and because it had saved Kibby, Alden would have tried to top the skill out. He might have gone down some side paths, but not that many before he noticed that Bear just kept growing and growing. Who knows what the system would have shown me to manage me? And when? It could have been worse than I'm thinking. But still. He could have locked everything else behind the tattoo, all the other tidbits, without making it impossible for me to tell another person what my own skill really is. I hate Roden right now, he blurted. Stuart, who had been kneeling there like a model of respectfulness and patience, looked understandably surprised by the response. We can gossip about him if you'd rather do that than talk about your skill, he said hesitantly. Maybe not on the learning cushions, though. No. Alden shook his head. Of course I'd rather tell you about my skill. I'll tell you what I can about all of my avowed abilities. I'll start with the smallest one. I have a spell impression that makes temper spheres scream and turn invisible. I can show you. I've got a sphere in my bag. Hold on just a moment. He forced himself to stop dwelling on the fact that he was still bound to keep his mouth shut by a wizard who had changed his mind about using Alden some more in the future and told him to forget all of their lessons and take the easy road for a few decades. That kind of thing will drive me nuts if I let it. Instead, he leaped up and hurried across the room to grab his messenger bag from the other side of the bed. When his hand wrapped around the glass ball in the bottom of the bag, he had a surge of unfamiliar discomfort. When he identified it, he didn't know what to think. Am I seriously embarrassed to show Stuart my spell impression? Because it's so much less than what he showed me? He didn't want to be that way about it. I've never managed to do anything very useful with this one, he admitted. Yet. Although brutes do enjoy borrowing invisible balls and throwing them at people. I'll just. You might want to cover your ears. Alden tossed the ball onto the bed and activated the impression. His fingers and lips moved. His focus narrowed. The temper sphere turned invisible and shrieked. And that's it. He let his arm drop back down by his side and stared at the dimple in the sandy brown bedspread where the invisible sphere lay. So. That's a thing I do. I can make it scream as many times as I want before the invisibility wears off. He seriously doubted Stuart was staring at his back thinking, how pitiful. But Alden hadn't expected to be thinking it and feeling it quite this hard himself. Even though he didn't like the way the spell impression felt and he wasn't passionate about it, he'd enjoyed showing it off to Jeremy the first time he had used it. Making something invisible was still interesting. It's just different because Stuart knows more about everything. That's all. There weren't a lot of Riabi single quote spell impressions I wanted from the list the contract offered to fill out my affixation, he explained. The silence stretched until it was so uncomfortable he considered making the damn sphere scream again. You couldn't find anything you wanted more on the list? Stuart asked finally. Was it so limited? Alden swallowed. I was annoyed by it at the time, but that was a personal. There were spells I would enjoy having so much more. There really were. A lot of them. The rabbit spell impression list hadn't actually been bad. It had been a good list for rabbits. But Alden had automatically dismissed all of the low-rank household spells as boring and useless. Because I couldn't use them to get into CNH or fight crime. He could have taken a spell that fluffed pillows, dusted surfaces, or straightened stacks of paper and used it 100 times by now. What's this spell impression for anyway? He asked. Do you know? No. Stuart's voice was a little higher than usual. I swear I can hear him blushing back there. Alden looked around. Sure enough. For some reason, the sight of Stuart's single quote squirming on his cushion and turning purple like the terrible liar he was, made Alden feel instantly more at ease. Whoa. Your face. Did I take a spell for something completely awful? You've got to tell me now. It's not. Stuart said. It's useful. It's good. What is it? Are you trying to think up an amazing use for it? Stuart cringed. Alden walked back over to kneel on his cushion again. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to start my show with the spell impression I regret picking. And then I acted weird about it. I'm really fine. Stuart's hands were resting on his thighs. They tightened into fists. I don't want you to have any regrets. Thank you, but... Alden scratched at the fading mark where his injured left hand had been mud-healed. That's probably unavoidable, isn't it? In my case. Let me back up. You know that I'm going to superhero school now, and you also know that I don't actually think I want the job. At least not the version of it most people are there hoping for. The hero schools are just the best places for skill development, and I want to develop mine. Thagund's still bothering me. You want to challenge yourself, said Stuart in a serious voice. To master your abilities. Yes. But what you don't know is that I used to think I wanted a superhero job. I admired a superhero I knew. She was confident and kind, and she was good at being inspiring. So I wanted to be more like her. I wanted to support other avowed with my powers and together we'd stop evil people from hurting innocent ones. We'd be. An English phrase, more than the sum of our parts. Stuart was listening with a fascinated expression. When I was selected by the contract, that was what I wanted. And I still think it's a good ideal, especially the part about not being on your own when you're fighting something bad. I'm just not sure it's what I want for my future anymore. I was naive. I'm a little envious of you, Stuart. When you talk about your choosing season, I want it for myself so much. If I could choose my talents now, for the person I am now, I'd spend years thinking and getting to know myself before I picked. If that was an option. He closed his eyes and sighed. When I was selected, I was just so focused on the wrong things. I didn't realize how much I was rushing, but I was rushing. My friends and I thought of fixing as soon as possible during my class trading period would give me extra time to practice with my new abilities before I had to leave to go to Nzidora. Which would give me a better chance of getting into the school I wanted. Which would give me the job I wanted. And that seemed like the most important thing. And it was exciting. So I didn't ask myself enough questions, and everything fell into place quickly. I decided on my skill in just a few days. A strangled gasp of horror made Alden's eyes snap open. And then he almost fell backwards off his cushion at the sight of Stuart's nose a millimeter from his own face. Stuart. You have a habit of sneaking up on. What planet's days? Stuart shouted in an appalled voice. Alden stared at him. Are you hoping I'll name one with a slower rotation than Earth or the Artonas? Yes. Still leaning back, Alden couldn't help but roll his eyes at the intensity in Stuart's voice. Earth days. Obviously. And yes. I know. You're weaving a friendship with a big idiot. Stuart brought his hands up to his cheeks and finally returned to his starting position on his own cushion. Are you miserable greater than? He asked in a whisper. No. Do you hate yourself? No. And you look sick. Like you're the one who ate a container full of oil. I promise I don't hate myself. Or being an avowed. Or my talents. And my skill is way more important than the rest of what I chose anyway, and it's exactly the kind of power I wanted for myself back then. If Gorgon had described the skill in vivid detail instead of giving just a name, Alden doubted he'd have hesitated to grab it. The special skill that could get stronger than others, the one that resembled Hannah Elber's power, the one that demanded sacrifice, I'd have eaten it up. I'd have thought a lot of the things that worry me now were positives. The fact that it was a rare skill that would capture the interest of important Artonans would have given him pause. The possibility of being always, or almost always, on someone's away from Earth would have occurred to him. And the entrustment requirement might have made him hesitate, too. But other than that, going from having nothing to having the ability to do magic was thrilling for me. I don't want you to think it was some awful moment. Almost every child on Earth hopes they'll become avowed at some point. I just didn't guess right about how my life would go after it happened and how I'd change and grow up because of it. He watched Stuart's face. I didn't mean to upset you. Would you change your skill now? Stuart asked, voice still a little faint. If you could. No. I'm sorry for asking. It's not Anne. It's fine. I'm the one who took the conversation here. I wanted to be forthcoming about the things I could afford to be forthcoming about. I want to tell you stuff about myself. And my answer is, I don't even know how to wish I'd chosen a different skill. Everything that's happened to me this year has happened because I chose that skill. I wouldn't just undo it. If I did, I would be a different person, with different friends, in a different place. I wouldn't know anything. I'd probably be a brute or an adjuster down in F. I would have gotten over being rejected from Chilena North by now, and I'd either be focused on prepping for uni tryouts or I would have met some people and encountered some ideas that made me switch gears. Maybe Bo would have told me the truth about himself sooner. Maybe I wouldn't have tried CNH at all. Maybe I'd be an unregistered living in Chicago because a few extra months influenced me in a different way. Those might-have-beens didn't really matter. I don't want to live in a universe where I never helped Kibby escape from that place. Or in one where I don't ever get to catch season jars with a future knight of the mother planet. Stuart sat up straighter. I don't hate myself, said Alden. I don't hate my skill. It's a great one. I just recognized that everything flowed from that one choice that I made so quickly. And here I am, a slightly different person wishing that it didn't feel like so many of the most important decisions in my life were already made. When Stuart didn't say anything else, Alden cleared his throat. Anyway, what's the spell impression for? Back when I chose it, I imagined myself using it as some kind of distraction in fights. We could find a way for you to do that with it. That's not necessary. Just tell me what it's actually good at. If you know. Stuart clasped his hands together. I think they use temper spheres that way in Jotanda killing a seasonal pest known to infest houses in large numbers greater than. Alden reread the translation. So it's excellent. Important. Stuart was saying. Nobody wants an infestation. Part of my authority is eternally bound to pest control. I can kill one particular kind of alien roach using an overpriced glass ball. Does the loud sound scare them to death? Do wizards really need an avowed to come do that for them? Maybe it's supposed to be part of a larger housekeeping package. Make the beds, mop the floors, scream the seasonal infestation to death. He snorted. Are you devastated greater than? Stuart said. Don't be deaf. I'm good. I'm great. Alden laughed. I can kill things for people in Jotanta. Thanks for solving the mystery. Let's talk about my better magic. Line of asterisks. The best way to show off Bearer was to show what he'd been doing with it for the last few weeks, so Alden shared all of his gym highlights with Stuart. It was eye-opening in a lot of ways. Stuart was even more focused than usual, and he was asking a ton of questions about everything. But although he'd had such firm opinions about some of Alden's regular classes, he made only a few judgments when it came to gym. An occasional comment on weapons he recognized, several on whether or not his spell impression had been used to its best effect. Beyond that, he actually had a much worse sense of whether Alden's classmates were doing well or poorly than Alden did himself. I feel like I'm introducing a kid to a new sport. Only the kid is familiar with a similar sport featuring racehorses, and this one is being played by, like, dachshunds. Do you feel you did well there? Stuart asked, replaying the moment when Alden had lifted one of the heavy bags off the scaffolding and brought it down with his paracord. I was showing you that to talk about distance limitations. When I'm shielding something that extends a long way from my body, like the cord does here, I tire myself out faster. This was actually at the very beginning of term. Let me show you something I started to figure out last week. Here. Look. Alden shared the video of him catching the tennis balls. I'm proud of this, so I saved it for last. This is the newest, most impressive thing I've discovered about my skill. Well, the most impressive thing that I can actually do somewhat on purpose instead of waiting until I'm nearly dead and in a crisis mental state. Morrison Waker was flinging a Wimbledon's worth of tennis balls at the Alden on the video. He minimized the image on his own interface so that he could more easily see Stuart's reaction. Notice my eyes are closed. Notice how cool and magic-y my skill and I are being together. He knew just how Stuart had felt showing off his beam transport spell earlier. Don't get too excited. He probably won't realize what's happening at first. We had to watch the replays a few times before Lexi noticed. Your eyes are closed. Stuart exclaimed the second the Alden on the video shut them. They are. How did you do that? He does think it's cool. I was really focused, and I felt like I was in the zone. Sorry, I can't think of how to say that in Artonan right now. And something important was here. Alden made a gesture he'd seen Kippy use a couple of times, a grabby motion with both hands beside his own ears. It was the equivalent of saying an idea was right in front of your nose or that you were on the verge of a breakthrough. So I focused on the fact that Instructor Waker was throwing things at me. Stuart looked surprised. Were you not focused on that already? He was throwing a lot of yellow balls at you. I didn't phrase that well. I'm just happy you noticed and I'm talking too fast. He threw so many. They are very yellow. Yes. I know. What I meant to say was I stopped thinking of it as him throwing weapons at me. I started thinking of it as him throwing something to me. And there was this feeling of getting it. You were only getting some of them. No. Getting it is a way of saying truly understanding in English. So I was getting it more than normal. My skill. And it felt like the gym faded away and what really mattered was Instructor Waker being my entruster and me being the bearer of all burdens. He almost said the words. But they wouldn't come. He hadn't meant to say even this much, but here they were. And Alden wanted to share something real and important he'd noticed about his skill. With someone. With Stuart single quote H, who had spent the past day sharing real and important truths of his own. What am I doing? I just thought about how this was a bad idea even if I kind of want. The secrecy contract had stopped him. The gremlin was awake now and giving him the mental equivalent of a suspicious look, like it thought he might be thinking of trying something forbidden. Rodin told me I might be summoned into a bullet. He said Stuart's father would somehow make my life an endless misery if he ever found out about my skill. I shouldn't want to. He had probably only gotten this far into his explanation because he'd had no intention of arriving at this moment when he'd set out. And now he was just kneeling here with his mouth hanging open and his thoughts scattered. Alden? Stuart asked. His eager expression morphed into an amused smile. What is it? Alden stared into his rust-colored eyes. I mean it's probably for the best, right? A voice in his head said. What were you going to do? Trust him with your life this fast? Alden took a breath. He shut his mouth. The endless misery was probably something obvious. Like being summoned a lot. Or being forced to train the skill for the good of the true planets or something. Everything under the intensity 99.9 category probably qualifies as endless misery to Joe. Alden. You just stopped talking so suddenly. Are you all right? I hate Whirly Rodin. Echoing Clerm's greater than. Stuart exclaimed. What's he been doing on Earth to make you keep saying that? Nothing. He's working so hard that half of the people on Anzidor think he's a Hentai. Stuart's face scrunched. You should correct them. I will. But let me tell you some things about Rodin. I was so happy to see him on Earth because I didn't expect to get the chance to meet him again. And I did go to a dangerous Chaos Moon to pick berries that he wanted. He paid me, but I thought since so much had happened, maybe we'd talk about some of it. I wanted to drink some webby or some tea and tell him how his loyal assistants died. Because I thought he might want to know where their bodies fell so he could honor them. And I wondered if he personally knew Kibby's new guardian. I just wanted to make sure they were a good person who would take good care of her. A short period of socialization, him acting like I was a person instead of a broken tool he couldn't safely use anymore. Obviously that was crazy of me. He ran away from me like I was a demon, and I had to chase him into an elevator and force him to talk to me. And then he told me he would speak to me for the time it took to go up 20 floors and then never again. Stuart's mouth was hanging open now. Alden replayed everything he'd just said in his head. He adjusted his position on the learning cushion. Thanks for letting me drop all of that on you. It just surprised me that he would treat me that way. He hurt your feelings. Alden grimaced. He did a little. Stuart made a doubtful humming sound. More than a little, Alden admitted. I didn't think we were friends. But I thought he would respect what I'd been through enough to give me some of his time without acting like everything was about him. Or something like that. Last week, said Stuart, he made us practice identifying the elemental alignments of a residue greater than embedded within the fourth bowel greater than of a dead large quadrupedal animal from left bugru greater than. Yuck. My arm was almost too short to reach. Alden blinked. You had to reach. You couldn't use a spell? Or a knife? He is a foul greater than instructor. I could sense the alignments from the exterior, but he kept acting like there was some secret within that I might be missing. I was afraid to be mistaken, so I had to reach inside and feel around like everyone else. He shuddered. If you want, I'll tell you all the rumors my classmates shared about him after that lab. Tempting. Very tempting. Our time is too precious to let him steal any more of it, Alden said. Wouldn't you rather throw things at me and see if we can get my skill to work like it did in that video? Stuart nodded. I would. Me too. They stood from their cushions, and Alden headed over to the bed to pick up the temper sphere he tossed there. Alden. He turned back. Stuart stared at him for a few seconds. I'm going to say this even though it may not need to be said. It will be heavy for me if I don't. Alden drew a sharp breath. It would upset me, said Stuart single quotation, if you ever accepted a skill or a spell that didn't perfectly suit greater than you, just because it was the best available on the list offered by Earth's contract. Then, he smiled. Alden didn't know what his own expression looked like, but he was sure it wasn't bland. I don't know much about the options human avowed have, Stuart added, but I do know it's possible for me to increase those options for you. And it wouldn't be hard. So if you didn't ask, and you ended up with another spell impression that you didn't even know the purpose of, it would upset me. A lot. Alden found his voice. Or someone's anyway. It sounded like it belonged to another person when he finally used it. Thank you. I understand. Yes? Alden placed a hand over his chest. I'm glad, said Stuart. And stop being envious of my choosing season while you're busy with one of your own. When you were standing out in the storm and we spoke of life purposes, as the two of us tend to do, thought Alden. I was thinking how good it was to talk to someone who recognized that he had important choices to make, too. You should contemplate. And I won't bother you about it unless you ask me for advice. That's how a choosing season should be. Toad continued.